from their encounters with races from other planets. The information is the activation. Let's awaken this world together. We are the forever students, and we will not be silent. We are the ones that we've been waiting for. It's pretty wild. Welcome, everybody, to Full Spectrum Universe. My name is Rob Yoxworthy, in battle broadcast that examines the past to remain in the present, to dictate the terms of our future. Welcome, hello, how are you? Buongiorno. For all those people who are watching us worldwide, shout out to you specifically from all across the world. My name is Rob Yox. This is going to be an amazing show, just like we've been doing. Tonight's a little bit more of a discussion, and we're going to be talking about the lost island of Mu. What we're going to do before we jump into the actual island information is I'm going to display a certain theory that I've been following, given to me by Stephen and Evan Strong. I'm going to make some major connections in showing people that when they say that man started in Australia, they have good reason to say so and why they say so. Now, of course, we know that they have a ton of information they've brought to the forefront to essentially give us this whole timeline. But I'm going to show you two pictures. And I'm going to show you these two pictures because these two pictures are indicative of the entirety of what we're talking about tonight as well. Now, when we talk about Mu, Mu is an island, or Mu, however you say it, is an island that was supposedly the religious epicenter of the world when it came to fruition. This was also a island around the same time of Atlantis and Lemuria. And essentially, there have been some different ideas of what Mu was. Now, what we've done here is we've gone into some of the books that we've read, mostly the James Churchwood book, and it is just absolutely phenomenal what this gentleman is talking about. Now, when we oppose the out of Africa theory, we're saying that mankind started in different areas than the sub-Saharan Africa and would later become the African people were the Aboriginals. Now, there's different thought and different thought processes with this because some people believe, like myself, that there are pockets of civilization all over the world, and these pockets are brought about by extraterrestrial life, and essentially they are created in the image of those extraterrestrial lives. Now, if we look at what Mu is, and we look at Lemuria as well, which is also has a different name. That different name is the Kumari Kingdom, which is south of India. And I'm going to show it to you real quick because when I saw this, it blew my mind. So first, let's look at Mu, right? So if Mu is this center island, which is labeled, Australia is very, very close. So for the Aboriginals to become Native Americans, they would have to basically traverse a little bit of water, then a tremendous land, and then a little bit of water again. And from this point, man spread out all over to Russia, to Asia, to India. Now, let's look at Kumari Kingdom. Now, this is the most southern tip of India. This is also potentially Lemuria, which is connected to Australia, which would make and Madagascar, which would make this move from Australia to Africa that much more viable because it was on land and people could travel on land and not essentially have to take the water or find their way up through Thailand, walk across India, come down the deserts of Saudi Arabia and into Africa. So if this is something that we're looking at, this could be potentially the moment where life was sparked across the world from the ancient Aborigines, which is absolutely wild to think about. But this gives credence to, everything that we've talked about with Stephen and Evan Strong. There are different areas where different things come to fruition, and we're like, wait a minute, this is wild, right? It's pretty crazy to think about this. Now, there's also a different rendition of what mu might be. And we're going to show you that too, which is this picture. So we have Lemuria, which would have been where mu would be in the pictures we just looked at. And mu is in Asia and Australia, and of course, Atlantis being on the opposite side as well. But these were all directly connected in a sense of land or a small boat ride to the next one. So there's a lot to be said about what we're talking about. And there are there's a lot of controversy with what the Mu people looked like. Some people say that they looked indigenous. Some people say that they look white. Some people say that they look African. So there is contention across the entirety of history with what the Mu people looked like. So there's a lot that's unknown, but we're going to go through what is known, right? We're going to talk about the land itself. We're going to talk about where we have inklings of what Mu and the people of Mu were like from the different Ramnavidas and all these different texts from Egypt to Greece to India. And essentially, all of these people would have been relatively close to Mu, right? And Mu goes so far as we know that art mimics life and life mimics art. So if we go to the Marvel comic books, they also have the island of Mu, right? This is something that we've seen that some of these people who create movies and comic books and things like that tap in to this supernatural world or these supernatural phenomena world or this ancient history that's hidden. And in the comic books, Mu takes a dive like Atlantis did, right? The waters came above it and it sank, which is pretty crazy if you think about it, right? So they're basically mimicking what potentially could have happened to Mew. And I'm sorry I'm not following the comments just yet, but good to see you, Jason, Buckshot, Rockers. I saw Omar, Susan. Welcome, 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 everybody. We're just waiting for people to come in real quick. Another thing I wanted to discuss before we go into what we're going to talk about tonight, right? Where first is please like, share, subscribe. Also, we have an event coming up with Portal to Ascension, which yours truly is going to be a part of the true world history. Uncover your ancient origins and rewrite the history books. As you can see, my good friend Omar is there as well. Brad Olson, Michael Tellinger, Freddie Silva, other great friend Paul Wallace, Neil Gower, Adam Apollo, Dr. Samir Osmanovich. I mean, Steve Mera, so many great people are going to be a part of this epic 33 speaker 3-day event. It's going to be tremendous. So if you haven't gotten your tickets yet, we're going to get the link into the chat later on when there's a little bit more people here. And we're going to put it out there so you can get your tickets and be a part of this incredible event that we have coming up. Now, I'm going to be scattered throughout this event. Omar is going to be giving a presentation, which is epic. So there's a lot going on here, right? We have a lot of things to talk about tonight as well. And I don't know how far we're going to get. There may need to be a part 3 of this. But basically, we're just going to have a discussion. And, we're going to talk a little bit about the destruction of Mu. And it's strange because there's mysteries about where exactly it was, right? Or what kind of people were on it too. So this is a civilization for to catch some of the people up that flourished in the mid Pacific as we understand it, and was completely obliterated in a single night, from what we understand. Right. So a few decades ago, scientists would have been very doubtful about the possibility of the former existence, and that's been called into question as well. Right, especially in the Pacific Ocean, but an ocean where there is a vast amount of ocean and we know about pole shifts and the different civilizations essentially that basically were island faring people that are scattered across all of the Pacific. Essentially, we would have there could have been a common thread between all of them, which would have been a larger sized continent, right? So Mu is referenced in a ton of ancient manuscripts, including such classics as the Hindu epic, Ramayana, written by the sage and the historian Valmiki, right? So we know that. And this is also from dictation of Narana, the high priest of the Rishi temple at Ayodhya. And basically, it mentions the Naakals and the Naakals coming to Burma from the land of their birth in the east. And that's in the direction of the Pacific Ocean, right? Another document confirming the story of the sacred tablets and Valmiki and the Troiano manuscripts, if I'm saying it right, right, which reside in the British Museum. There's even an ancient Maya book written in the Yucatan, and it speaks of the land of Mu and using Mu, the same symbols we find in India. Right? We're going to show you these symbols later. We're going to show you the Egyptian, the Indian, and the Mayan. And they're almost identical, which shows that there's a common ancestor because of linguistics. So we're not just telling you things tonight. We're bringing receipts for sure. And it's going to be epic when we get to that point, too, because you're going to look at this and say, wow, this is wild. So right now we're referencing two books. We're referencing The Lost Continent of Mu and The Children of Mu, just so you know. So there's another codex where the Maya basically talk about the same age as the Toronto manuscripts as well. And there is the Lhasa records. There's also hundreds of other records from Egypt, Greece, Central America, and Mexico, and the cliff writings in our western states of the United States, where they found some of the fingerprints and the handprints dating back to 45,000 years, which would lay credence to the fact that history goes back way further than anything that they're telling us right now, right? So the third thing we're gonna reference to show that Mu was an actual place was the existing runes by their location and the symbols that decorate them that essentially reference the motherland of man or the continent of Mu. There's also that people can say the Easter Island has some of these relics as well. There's so many different places. So there's also talk about Mu in Japan, China, and the South Sea Islands, right? Which is crazy. And some of the ancient Native American tribes also reference Mu. So there's a lot of contradictory reports saying that Mu was just something that became a conspiracy theory for specific scientists down the line. And they tried to use this specific conspiracy to get ahead. But there are archaeological records of all of this. And there's even runes that they found at the bottom of the Pacific Ocean that would also lend credence to Mu and their location. And but there's also the Marianas Trench, which actually eats up a lot of the older architecture and all of the statues, things like that as well. And it's basically the fault line that lies on the Ring of Fire. So again, we're going to bring a picture up, which looks a lot like Easter Island, right? With the heads that come above ground, but the major portion of the statue is underneath the ground, which could also like it could also lay claim to a mud flood or some sort of other disaster where there was ash and soot that buried these things, or the peoples had some sort of ritual where they buried these statues themselves, which is always something we can talk about. There's a lot here, right? So while this is up, we're going to keep going here. So we see that there's a lot to be said that lends Mu the ability to exist. So right now, I want to pull up the codex of the languages that Mu, Egypt, and the Mayans all derive their language from, which again shows a common ancestry, which is huge. So I'm sure you're seeing this now, and this is from the book that we referenced before. So let's take this picture down so you can see it because I did one and not the other. But there we go. So here is the full screen to make it bigger so you can see it. Now, the similarity of this is just it's uncanny. Now, some variations are apparent again, but there seems to be a root language at play here. So when we look at these cave paintings or these hieroglyphs, and we look at the history of Mu, it's essentially giving us these stories via pictographs or petroglyphs. And what that does is that tells us that there is an amazing amount of connection between these cultures, and they are three pivotal points across the world. Again, there's a connection here. So let's break it down a little bit further. We're going to stop sharing the screen for a second so I can maneuver around here and really get to some of the different aspects of Mu, which bring us to fruition when we talk about this stuff. It's so incredible that they talk about what they say about Mu is incredible. We're going to talk about a little bit of that right now. We're also going to reference the records of which it comes from so that you guys can basically make your own assumptions when we're thinking about this. So, at one time, there was supposedly 64 million people that were made up into 10 tribes, each distinct from the other, but all under one government, which is wild. It's wild. So keep that in mind. So as far back into the very remote times, many thousands of years ago, yet on the edge of what we call the historical time, there was a great continent again in the middle of the ocean where now we find only water and sky and groups of small islands, of course, which today are called the South Sea Islands. So it was beautiful and three tropic countries with vast plains and also with valleys that covered rich grazing grasses and tilted fields, while the low rolling hilllands were shaded and luxuriant, and the growth of tropical vegetation also was encountered here. There were no mountains or mountain ranges that stretched themselves through this earthly paradise, which is why some people reference this area as potentially the Garden of Eden, for the mountains had not yet been forced up from the bowels of the earth. So the great rich land was intersected and watered by many broad, slow running streams and rivers, which would basically make ways in these fantastic curves and bends around the wooded hills and through these fertile plains. So we see these what we just talked about directed in the Lhasa records, the Easter Island tablets, the Greek records, and the Triano manuscripts. So the vegetation also covered a whole of the land with a soft and pleasing, restful mantle of green. Bright and fragrant flowers on trees and shrubs adding color and finish to the landscape. Tall frond palms, fringed with the ocean shores, and lined the banks of the rivers for the many miles inland. Great feathery ferns spread out their long arms out through these river banks. In valley spaces where the land was low, the rivers broadened out into shallow lakes around the shores, and the myriads of sacred lotus flowers, which again, which is somewhat significant of the flower of life, also the covenanted symbol of the island of Mu. So there's also the dotted and glistening surface of the water with the varicolored jewels in the settings of emerald green. So over these cool rivers, gaudy winged butterflies hovered in the shade of the trees, rising and falling in the fairy tale like movements, as if better to view their painted beauty in the nature's mirror. Darting hither and thither from flower to flower, hummingbirds made their short flights glistening like jewels in the rays of the sun. Feathered songsters in bush and tree vied with each of their own sweet lays. The chirping of the lively crickets filled the air, while above all other sounds and those of the locusts and this industrious grounding in his scissor, telling the world all was well with him. Roaming through the primeval forest, where herds of mighty mastodon and elephants flapping their big ears to drive off annoying insects. The great continent was teeming and happy with life, with over 64 million human beings who reigned supreme. All this life was rejoicing in its luxuriant home. Now, this is taken from various records, from the SA records, from the Easter Island tablet, from the Indian and Maya records, and the Triano manuscript. So we see that there are pockets where all different life was coming together, even those of the dinosaur. They said about the mastodon. And we also have carvings of Stegosaurus and some of the more primitive yet ancient civilizations, which showed that man and dinosaur lived side by side, right? So there's a lot to be said with why this would happen. Jason, thank you for becoming a member. All the support goes into this programming and getting us into the essence of who we are. So many of us have probably had a past life in Mu, which is why we're ascending now, because we've already been to that pinnacle. And I appreciate your support, and all of that again goes into what we do here and bringing this information and purchasing these books to go through them and essentially find all of the tidbits that we need to put these timelines together, and that takes a long time. So I appreciate all the help I can get, and the financing of you the people is really remarkable and humbling, and I love it, and I appreciate all of you so much. So as we keep going, there's a broad and smooth were the roads that ran in every direction like a spider web. So now we're getting into the technological aspects of it. So we just talked about the plant life, the animal life, what kind of climate or what it would be like. But now we're getting into a little bit of the infrastructure of what was there, right? So the stones, they had stone roads, which means that they could potentially have had the wheel or even more technologically advanced things, which they made so perfectly, matched the grass and could not grow between them, right? So the grass couldn't grow between the cobblestone roads that they had. They had probably a cement like substance. This is showing technological prowess for the time, right? And at the time, again, there were the 64 million people that were made up of 10 tribes or peoples, each distinct from each other but under one government. Many generations before, and the people had selected a king. And here's where it gets kind of wild, right? So this king had an added prefix, which was Ra to his name. So he became the hierarchical head and emperor under the name Ra Mu. The empire received the name the Empire of the Sun. Now, there are two civilizations that reference Ra and the sun, one of which is the sun of Japan, the rising sun, which could have been an offshoot of Mu. The second is Egypt with Ra and Mu. They saw Ra in Egypt as the creator or the god of creation. So for the emperor to be called Ra, he's given the title of the deity, right? So all followed the same religion or worship of the deity through the symbols that we've deciphered. All believed to be immortal of the soul. which soul eventually returned to the great source whence it came. So great was their reverence for their deity that they never spoke his name, and in prayer and supplication addressed him always through his symbol, Ra, the sun. What's Ra the god of in Egypt? He's the sun god, right? Was this the same Ra? And this was also used as the collective symbol for all of his attributes. As a high priest, Ramu was representative of the deity in religious teachings. It was thoroughly taught and understood that Ramu was not to be worshipped, as he was only a representative. So they were far enough along to not let this person gain this power over everything that was immutable, right? Only the creator had that. So, also at this time, the people of Mu were highly civilized and enlightened. There was no savagery on the face of the earth, nor had there ever been, since all of the people on earth were the children of Mu, and under the banner of the motherland. So this portion came from the East Island tablets, the manuscript, the Lhasa records and others, the I bead, and the Maya, and as well as other Native American cultures to be collaborating. Wild. So this is where we get into an inflection point in the information. Now, the gentleman that I'm referencing believed that the people of Mu were fair white people, right? So, can I say that that is what it is, without a doubt? No, I can't say that because it wouldn't be right for me to say that. We don't have the records to really pinpoint this. All of this is what we understand from the writings of others, right? So, as we get ourselves prepared, this is where he goes into the race of these people. Why he may be right, he may be wrong at the same time. I just want to preface that because we don't really know. But they say that the dominant race in the land of Mu was a white race, exceedingly handsome people with clear white or olive skin tones, large and soft dark eyes, and straight black hair. Besides this, there were other races of people with Asian descent, brown and black skins. They, however, were more of the on the outskirts as opposed to the major population, from what we understand. These ancient inhabitants of Mu were great navigators and sailors, which would give credence to what we talked about in the beginning with the Aboriginals moving either from Mu to Australia or from Australia to Mu to Native Americans. And also, if we look at Lemuria and there was land there as well, it gives credence to the African population as well, right? As we keep going over this. So they took their ships all over the world, from the east to the western oceans, and from the north and the south seas. They were also learned a lot of architecture. They also built great temples and palaces of stone, and they carved and set up great monoliths and monuments. In the land of Mu, there flourished seven great or principal cities, or the seats of religion, science, and learning. There were many other large cities, towns, and villages scattered throughout the three lands. This island of Mu was divided into three sectors, right? There is, we'll get to that. I have yet to find a picture of that, but it's described a lot, right? So many cities were built or near the mouths of the great rivers, much like we saw across the entirety of the world with the ancient civilizations. These being the seats of trade and commerce. When ships passed and basically to and from all parts of the world, the land of Mu was the mother and the center of Earth's civilizations. Learning, trade, and commerce, and all countries throughout the world were her colonies or colonial empires. So, according to these records, inscriptions, and traditions, man's advent on earth was in a land of Mu. And on this account, the name land of Kui was added to that of Mu. There's a great carved stone temple with out there basically without roofs, sometimes called the transparent temples, adorned in the cities. The rooflessness being to permit the rays of Ra to fall on the heads of those in supplication and prayer, a symbol of acknowledgement by the deity. The wealthy classes adorned themselves with fine remnant and jewels, precious stones, much like we see everywhere else. They lived in imposing palaces, attending to many servants, things like that. So, this part came from the Traiano manuscripts with the Codex of Costanani and others. This also came from Valmiki, the Lhasa record, and the Traiano manuscripts and inscriptions. So, there's a lot here, right? And we're going to keep going, but there's a lot to be said about this. And again, we reference the early points of organized religion and whether this was the pinnacle of it. What I'm hearing when we read this or when we listen to this, it sounds like this was the beginning of where we could say the Anunnaki or some other races created this faction of mankind. And it flourished for thousands of years. To have 64 million people, it would have to have been around for generations. Generations. I mean, hundreds of generations, right? Now, again, if we look at what we know to be a potential for the beginnings of mankind, there were three separate pockets of humanity. There were the Aboriginals, right? Or the Lemurians, the Atlanteans, and the Mu. Each one having a potential, well, it could be the same, but from what we understand, they had different broad entities or outer space entities that ushered them into their humanity. Now, when there is a great cataclysm, they all come together and then they start to mix, and that's where we get humanity now. From Neanderthal to a specific race of people, Atlantean, Lemurian, or Mu. The great cataclysm happens. All go underground. When underground, they interbreed with each other, and then we get humanity as we see it right now. Now, there were probably some um, discrepancies on some factions of these people who didn't interbreed, much like the traditionalists of today don't see certain countries the same, and the people who are not of the loving faith of each other, right? But I'm sure that there were some back then as well. So they stayed to their own little pockets, which in turn shows the variety of man that would later become to populate the entirety of Earth. So there's a lot to be said here. And there's a lot of information that leads to ancient Egypt. So if we think about the centers of civilization in the next generations from these three cities, it would be Egypt, China, and North America or South America, with three distinct different types of people populating them, which eventually, when we get into later into the 18th and 1900s, the mixing of all peoples becomes more congruent, right? So this is a cycle, much like everything else on this planet. And the energetics go from a very high level to a de-evolution, as Michael Cremo would put it. Now we're on the evolving ascension path. So we're getting back to those places where we once were, right? So it's crazy to think about all of these different ancient civilizations that started mankind and how each of them had their own aesthetic, but their own religion, their own culture. There's so much to be said about each of them, right? So now This is where a lot of these civilizations reside underwater, right? This is what we see all over the place. Now, again, there are maps that show different areas that were categorized as these different lands. So there's contradictions to each and every statement that we're saying, where somebody is basically arguing that this is not the place, this is not the people. So it's very convoluted. So we're doing our best to break apart the convolutions and get to what the people were about, regardless of what they looked like, what they practiced, just so we can get an idea of those first lines of humanity, right? This might even be tailored to the root races, which could have come before this or after. We're not sure. The Hyperboreans, right? All those types of peoples. So there's a lot that's still ambiguous, I guess is the best way to say it. But we're doing our best to put it together, right? So we start to see that these great navigators and their ships were constantly carrying passengers and merchandise from various colonies, right? And even on cool evenings, it might have been seen to be a joyous occasion to go into the ships and sail the oceans. And it would be basically they could do all different types of parties, things like that, music. They had everything. So while this great land was thus at its zenith, at the center of Earth's civilizations, the learning, trade, and commerce, with great stone temples and huge statues and monoliths that they set up, they received a rude shock. A fearful visitation overtook it. Rumblings from the bowels of the earth, followed by earthquakes and volcanic outbursts, shook up the southern parts of the island itself, along with the southerly shores, and the great cataclysms of waves from the ocean rolled in over the land. Now, there was a tremendous destruction. The volcanoes belched out their fire, smoke and lava. The country being flat, the lava did not run. It piled up, right? Forming cones, which subsequently became in igneous rock and are still able to be seen today on the southern islands. So eventually the volcanic workings ceased. The volcanoes died out, and since it's remained silent. So after the cessation of the volcanic workings, the people of the land of Mu gradually overcame their fright. This portion comes from the Lhasa records, Valmiki, the remains on the islands, the Easter Islands and other islands, and the Abid. So the ruined cities were built and rebuilt, and trade and commerce resumed. Many generations after this visitation, and when the phenomena had become past history, Mu again became victim to these earthquakes. The whole continent heaved and rolled like the ocean waves crashing down on it. The land trembled and shook like the leaves in the tree of a storm. Temples and palaces came crashing to the ground, and monuments and statues were overturned. The cities were heaps of ruins. And as the land rose and fell, quivered and shook, the fires underneath burst forth, piercing the clouds in roaring flames 3 miles in diameter. They were met with lightning shafts which filled the heavens, a a thick pall of smoke that overshadowed the lands themselves. Huge cataclysmic waves rolled in and over the shores and extended themselves over the plains. The cities and all things went down to destruction. Agonizing cries in the multitude filled the air. So we see that these people, again, have a cataclysm. Now, if you know where this position of this specific island is, it's the Ring of Fire. And the Ring of Fire is one of the most active volcanic spots in on the whole planet. The whole thing. It's insane, right? So now that we've gone into a brief history, we're at 40 minutes right now. And I think this is where we're going to be stopping the information today. But we're going to take 5 minutes. We're going to talk about what we just went through, right? And there's so much that we've contextualized from these different civilizations that would come later, right? We know that the Egyptians referenced Atlantis, right? We know that some of the other peoples of the ancient civilizations talked about Lemuria. What if, this is a big what if, what if Atlantis and Lemuria were both Mu but of a different name? What if Mu had a little bit different of a design and it connected to North America from the Asian continent? It was that big or that vast. And when they talk about Atlantis, Atlantis was North America. Lemuria was South America. There's so many different ways we can literally go through this and look at these patterns. But one thing we do know for sure that from this cataclysm or other cataclysms like Atlantis and Lemuria and Mu, they've all went through this cataclysm. And this cataclysm set about either a flood or an ice age, which man had to burrow its way out of. And when it comes back, they run to the higher points like Egypt, India, right? The Middle East, drier, less volcanically active areas, because this is what they're going through leading up to these generations within these Pacific or Atlantic, civilizations. So there's a lot to be said, and there's a lot more we're going to dive into. We're going to do a part 3. I think this is in turn of a part 3. And I think that we've gotten a lot of good information so far. And I would ask that you please like, share, and subscribe this out, right? Share this out everywhere, because when we start to get people this information, they'll start to see that their timeline runs through these 3 islands, right? Lemuria, Mu, Atlantis. We've all gone through lives, or most of us have gone through past lives in these places. So by reliving this information and being this descriptive, like James Woodward talks about, we're able to see what that lifetime was like, which in turn gives us more of our energetic self and shows us our path through this, what we call 3D reality in this time and space continuum right now. When we understand all aspects of ourselves now and then, we become our truest self, our best self, our infusing of the higher self because of this information. I challenge each and every one of you to meditate this evening, right? Meditate and ask your higher self about this information. Or meditate, get to the Akashic records. See if you can evaluate your Akashic record on where you were during this time. And I will bet majority of you have some lifetime in this area. And when you get that information, it will be amazing and it'll be empowering, because these people were closer to the creation point, which gives us more of a purity of who they were, right? And they were a purer people for the most part. So, with all that being said, um, this was fascinating to go through this evening. I just want to tell you all that I love you all from the bottom of my heart deeply. And I pray for each and every one of you. I hope we can get this community out to the masses, because we have so many intelligent people in the chat that have their own timelines constructed about this information. And it's incredible. It's incredible to see everybody commenting and saying what they believe and how it all kind of is congruent to each other and how we're all saying the same thing, all just from a different perspective, right? So let's carry that through each and every day and show this unconditional love to everyone. I love you all. Please don't forget to leave a comment when this is finished. It helps the algorithm boost, and YouTube has kind of been, you know, throttling what we're getting out to right now. So if we could help share that out, we can enlighten the world, and that's our duty as ascending human beings to give this information to everyone. And remember, remember that we are the ones that we've been waiting for, and the information is the activation. I'm Rob Yox. This is Full Spectrum Universe. Have a great night, everybody.